Hello, today I'm going to be reviewing Tim Cook's new book, continuing his work in the First World War, with this one looking at the medical services and the Canadian War experience. And the title of the book, as you can see here, is Lifesavers and Body Snatchers, Medical Care and the Struggle for Survival in the Great War. Also, I want to say thank you to Shauna Cook from Penguin Random House Canada for sending me the book and giving me a chance to review it like this. So thanks again, Shauna. So I just want to start by talking about Tim Cook himself. Great historian, great guy, has helped me in numerous ways. I've worked for him many times at the Canadian War Museum. So Tim has recently revealed he's had some health problems. And he's made these public before, so this isn't new information. He's had issues with cancer in the past. Apparently, a new cancer has developed. So we're all wishing him the best and that he can get healthy quickly. I'm going to be taking a kind of academic book review type of style with this, but obviously just kind of recording it as a video. Looking at the things I would normally look at for an academic book review, which I've done, I don't know how many now, quite a few. So just kind of looking at it, how it fits in historiography, what it does well, some things it's not so good with, that kind of thing, to kind of add my insight in a different way as a historian with experience in these kinds of things. So the first thing I want to talk about is the space that this kind of occupies in Canadian military history, historiography. There's not too many books about the medical services in the First World War in Canada. There's a few that look at different things, different individuals. This one takes an all-encompassing view. But with Tim's work, what he does is he brings individuals' diaries, letters, first-hand accounts, all that into this bigger story. He's really a master of, weaving these stories into the bigger narrative, and does it in such a seemingly effortless way, even though I know that's not the case. But he's able to do that. So he kind of blends that archival research with that writing and excellent writing, and how he goes about doing this. So that's kind of how this book develops, just like his others. He's got a format down, and it's fantastic. So this one has a bit of a controversial element to it, and one that's probably caught a lot of people's attention is the idea of specimen collection, as it was called at the time, of dead Canadian soldiers, body parts, bones, tissue, all of that. That weaves its way throughout this narrative. Tim talks about that in the book almost from the beginning. He doesn't claim he's the first to discover this, because that's not the case. There's lots looking at this, particularly from the Canadian viewpoint, but from the Commonwealth viewpoint, British viewpoint, the American viewpoint. This is not new in that terms. This book adds to the historiography in terms of that it's a book-length project. Not to say that those articles aren't great and aren't doing an amazing job with the historiography, because they are. They are most definitely doing that. But the book allows more context to be developed, right? That's not a bad thing, right? That a book allows more to be done in terms of understanding the bigger picture. Articles and books try to do two different things. As a lot of people say, history is a conversation. So these articles kind of get that conversation going, providing that nitty-gritty detail, getting in, making those arguments. And then you have things like Tim's book, which bring it into a bigger context, allow us to understand what's going on, say, with the overall Canadian Army Medical Services in the war, and then kind of bringing this sort of part that is kind of known at the time, like that's not something that they're hiding at the time. This isn't done in nefarious ways. This is fairly well known. There was, exhibitions in museums. Like, this was attended by lots of people. Lots of people knew about this. Lots of people were discussing this. It's kind of one of those things in history that is known, kind of drops off, and then kind of comes back again with, historians start digging again. So I think that that's part of this, right? Tim talks about that in the book. So he says in here, right in the introduction, that combat and care are the focus of the book. That is what's really going on. He says the things of, that the harvesting of body parts is truly shocking. And he, juxtaposes that with things like the stretcher bearers and how they were called body snatchers in a lot of ways. Bodies, getting them off the battlefield, back to the medical centers to get them treatment. But then that obviously is taken on another meaning within terms of the removal of body parts by medical professionals during the war for exhibition and for teaching purposes. Tim does a great job talking about how that is something that is done, particularly throughout the 19th century, is that the specimens are used as a teaching tool. And it plays a major role in teaching new doctors and surgeons on how to do, their practices. So this is by no means the First World War a shocking thing in that regard. It's shocking to, kind of modern day sensibilities. particularly how we remember the war dead, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So, and I'm going to quote from the book here. The story has never been fully told, but my research into the nation's archives has revealed that almost 800 individual Canadian body parts, organs, and skeletal remains were extracted from Canadians killed at the front and sent to London, England, where they were stored, conserved, and put on display at the Royal College of Surgeons. Even more incredible, the first transfer of these Canadian body parts were sent to Montreal in 1918 to form a founding collection for a planned military medical museum that was to have been built in Ottawa. Now, as we know, that never happened. Canada doesn't really get a full-fledged war museum until much, much later. So that's something that obviously did not go ahead. And that's discussed at length in the book. So once you get your hands on a copy, I'll let you read that. I'm not going to talk about that too much because Tim does it better, way better than I can here. But that's an important part of this. So that kind of frames it. He's not claiming to be first, but a book-length project is something different in terms of, again, what I already spoke about, articles and those things. It's not that one is more valuable than the other. It's just different. So that's one of the things I just want to get out of the way to begin with, because that can be a bit of a controversial point when someone tries to, claim to be first. That's not what's happening in that direct context here. So Tim, one thing also about the body parts, the collection of soldiers' body parts, is it's not just told in one chapter. It's spread throughout. Kind of breaking it up as Tim does, right? Tim takes a very chronological order to his books, which I greatly appreciate because it helps keep things in context, helps you understand what's going on. So he'll talk about major battles and then kind of piece the book around that, talking about different things, right? He spends a lot of time talking about the Battle of Second Ypres and the impact that had on the medical services, right? With the first use of asphyxiating gases on Canadians and those around them has a major impact on the Canadian medical service, right? They're overwhelmed when these casualties start to roll back during the first attacks there in April 1915. Then he moves through talking about the Somme, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele. Passchendaele is also a particularly interesting part of this book because of the conditions of it, right? They're learning a ton, and then they kind of have not a regression, but the conditions make it so much harder to get wounded off the battlefield, which has a huge impact on how many survive. Another interesting part is he talks about the 100 days, right? That change from that static siege-like attritional trench warfare to a semi-open type of fighting, right? The casualties go up. They actually go higher because the nature of fighting has changed, right? Open warfare is extremely dangerous. And this is why the trench warfare develops, right? You dig to get away from bullets, shells, all of that stuff. Once you're out in the open, moving and pushing your enemy back, you're exposed again. So that leads to a high number of casualties. And again, the medical services have to adjust. And there's quite a few number of growing pains, particularly at the Battle of Amiens, starting August 8th, 1918. But they learn very quickly. That's the thing, too, is they've learned how to learn and how to adapt and change. And Tim does an excellent job talking about that. So Tim does an excellent job of providing context of the Canadian medical services in the First World War, kind of how they developed, the roles that nurses take on. That is a thread throughout the book that I think Tim does an excellent job in, using letters, articles, books, even correspondence that all kinds of nurses and their commanders wrote during the war and after to tell this story. That's an excellent part of this. And if that's something you're interested in, nursing history, Canadian nursing history, or nursing history in general, I highly recommend reading it for that aspect. It's extremely well done and a very enjoyable part of the book. So another thing that he talks about is how the battlefield is almost, in a way, a laboratory in a sense. It allows experimentation in terms of all kinds of things. New treatments are, pioneered on the battlefields, everything from stabilization splints for broken legs, understanding tuberculosis. Also, he details the failures. There's quite a few number of those where things are tried and they do not work. That's an overarching theme of the book as well. Not everything goes as you think. Another interesting part of this book that I did want to mention, it might be slightly controversial, even though it shouldn't be, is vaccinations. That's a huge part of Canada's war effort. In every war record, for those who fought as part of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, they had to get vaccinated to sign up. If they refused, they would not be allowed to enlist. So that's something that has been going on for quite a long time. He talks about those who are anti-vaccines back then, but also talking about the collective good, because public health is an important part of this book, as it was of the medical services during the First World War. It's another theme that Tim focuses on is the conditions, right? Trench warfare is awful. Living basically in a glorified irrigation ditch for days at a time, moving through different conditions, different parts of the front had different challenges. But one of the things that was common is keeping down disease. And that was done through sanitary work and learning and practicing and trying new things and getting people to buy into this. Was by no means easy, as things in the combat are not, but this is something that was done. Things like water chlorination, disposal of human waste, all of that gets an excellent examination in this book. And it's something that was definitely very interesting to learn into the details of how these things were done. But also, of course, you can't talk about the First World War medical without, the influenza outbreak. That forms another part of this book, very timely considering what we're still going through and have been going through since basically the beginning of 2020 with the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a very timely part of this book, but also helping us to understand where these things come from, why these measures are done, how it was done on the front lines, and what impact it had. Its impact on the German army is very well known, particularly towards the end of the war. But Tim talks about kind of the development of it in the Canadian army and kind of seemingly minor impact it would have as kind of the overall idea. But it did have some impacts, particularly the different waves of the influenza outbreak and what impact they had on the Canadian Army's ability to fight. It's a fascinating part of this book. So another thing I appreciate about this book is the usage of photos, propaganda posters, all of that fun stuff. So this is just an example here. It's an excellent look at kind of what it looks like, right, when you're using it. When you're reading it, it's an excellent look at it and a really enjoyable part of it. So you get kind of this context again with all these different things and something to sort of break up kind of the almost depressing elements that this book has. I mean, it can be quite a tough slog at times with all the losses, all the death and all of that. It can be quite difficult. So I really appreciated something to break that up. And it's included in pretty much every chapter. Again, it's great that he's done that. So that was really, really enjoyable. An important part of the book and an important part that I enjoyed very much was how Tim talks about those working in the medical services, those in the Canadian Army Medical Corps and the Royal Army Medical Corps, the stretcher bearers, the nurses, the voluntary aid detachment workers, the surgeons, all of that. It's great that there's so much that he was able to do and doing that, hard driving archival research to find these pieces to talk about this. So again, they get their story told with their own words in a lot of ways, which is why all of Tim's books have such a high value, high historical value, is because he includes all these things. And it's amazing that we have that and we have that ability to read this. So something that's kind of quite interesting and quite funny is, right, because he's talking about that and how the stretcher bearers are viewed. So kind of some of the stretcher bearers had kind of a bad reputation, particularly at the early chunks of the war, because some of them, like everywhere else, there are some unsavory characters and who would, lift the positions of the wounded on the battlefield. So the Royal Army Medical Corps, right, the acronym RAMC, was jokingly said to stand for "Rob All My Comrades." So that kind of, plays into it. There's satire for this. There's soldier comics, mentions in soldier newspapers, which are massive during the First World War. But this kind of also changes as the war goes on, and then the value that these stretcher bearers bring, particularly when they're bringing wounded off the battlefield, and the survival rate when someone has medical attention is massively high. It's almost 90% at certain points of the war. So that's huge. Like, that is not anything to scoff at. So that is an important part of this. But again, it's kind of that humor that Tim sometimes likes to inject into his work. He's done that again in other ones, particularly in the book where he talks about the lives and experiences of soldiers of the First World War, really in depth. The Secret History of Soldiers, another excellent book that I'll link down below that you can also purchase. Fantastic. It's full of that, but some of that works its way into here, and it's quite funny. So yeah, gas gets an important part of this book as well. Tim has done previous work on gas. It was his first book was on gas. So obviously it's going to play an important role in what the medical corps is thinking and how they're going about treating people, because they face that a lot, obviously, after April 1915. So it's an excellent part of the book, really eye-opening, and kind of what it does to soldiers. It's heartbreaking in so many ways that these doctors and nurses and the VADs are writing about this, and just they can't do anything for some of them. The damage is so extensive that they can't do a single thing to help them, and it's utterly heartbreaking. So another thread that Tim has throughout the book is, again, that harvesting of organs, tissues, bones, juxtaposed against how the dead of the First World War are viewed, right? Often the glorious dead, as it's said, right, that adorns memorials across the world. Tim uses that as kind of his thread through this, right? That the dead are treated as these Christ-like figures, but we're still taking body parts from them. It's a shocking sensibility to today's audiences. Maybe not so much back then, but that changes particularly really as the war comes to an end and things really start to change. And the government is also noting this change. Like I mentioned, there was this want to have a museum that quickly goes away. All of these, harvested organs and other things are not brought into a museum. They eventually are brought to Borden, but eventually and displayed, but that only lasts a short period of time. And Tim doesn't know what happens to them. He speculates that they were destroyed. We don't know. So another interesting part of the book is the discussion of shell shock. Obviously, a topic that's discussed all the time when it comes to the First World War, understanding of what we now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Tim talks about how kind of the modern understanding is developed. It comes from the First World War, talks about the symptoms of it, the exposure of soldiers to terrible conditions for an extended period of time, talks about how they see death constantly, all of that other things, that the poor conditions, lack of sleep, lack of good food, all of those play a role, lack of rest, all of it. And it's a very interesting discussion, taking into account some new historiography on the subject as well, which is really cool to see, especially some of it I've learned about from people firsthand. So it's great to see this getting in the book and integrating it in with a larger story. That's the part I really enjoyed, because again, it's threaded through, just like the body snatching, the stretcher bearers. It's all, woven through the entire narrative of the book and the entire argument. So I don't really have much to say negative about the book. There's not much. Obviously, you might think I'm biased, and maybe I am in terms of how I see Tim. But there's one thing I would have liked to see is maybe just a quick, more brief mention of the work that's been done more recently on medical history, particularly the First World War, particularly Canada. There's lots of great work being done out there by lots of great new and upcoming historians. I would have liked to see maybe those mentioned a little bit more, particularly the digging they've done, the research they've done on individuals. Obviously, you want to use primary sources as much as possible to tell these stories. So I'm not faulting it for that, but just kind of giving a better understanding of that new historiography. I know that's not easy to do with a book, and it takes a long time to get these processes down, writing, editing, literally printing them. It's not a quick, easy process. So doing these things is difficult. But I know in the last, within 10 or so years, there's been lots of good stuff done. So I would just like to see a little bit more of that discussed. I mean, it's used. I went through the endnotes, looking at all the references, lots of good sources used. Nothing really stuck out as a bad source being used. That sometimes happens in kind of these generalized books. Nothing like that. So that's a good part of it. So again, not really anything negative, but that's one positive. Or sorry, one negative I would have liked to see more of is just kind of some of that new research being done. So I think those who will enjoy this book is a wide audience, to be honest. Those interested in Canadian military history, I'm sure you're aware of Tim Cook's work. He's covered both world wars in depth. This is just another excellent addition to the collection. Those interested in medical history should also check this out. It covers all kinds of stuff. Those interested in the First World War should also definitely check it out. And Tim is just an excellent writer, so I think you'll enjoy that element of it. It was very hard to put down in certain cases getting through it, just because the writing is excellent, and I very much enjoy Tim's writing style. Yeah, it's fantastic. If you like the work I do with the channel, please remember to subscribe and like the video. Also, I'd like to see your thoughts on the book. Have you read the book? Have you read Tim's other books? Are you looking forward to this one? Leave your comments down below. Again, I've linked some places to buy the book, help me out just with a small commission. Also, where you can become a patron, YouTube channel member, get lots of benefits for doing so. So check those out in the description below.